Okay, so on to slide 8 now, and let's talk about Karl Marx's The German Ideology. So Karl Marx has kind of two or three key ideas, and contrary to what people think, they're actually not all about promoting communism, that sort of thing. In fact, one of the things that you might have noticed when you read The German Ideology was you might have felt shocked that actually he doesn't really seem to talk about communism too much. He doesn't really seem to mention it very much at all. So the German Ideology, obviously very, very famous essay now, we all know it. It was actually written, we think, around about 1846, but it wasn't actually published for the first time until 1932. And that was when, I think it was the Marx Engels Institute in Russia published it, which is quite interesting. It had to be Russia, of course. So Russia publishes it in 1932. This is why we have a bit of a problem when we try and apply it to text, because of course in 1932 it was first published, so people began to actually know of it properly. But the ideas have been around since 1846, so we can actually say that they might have influenced things like Heart of Darkness. But we can't necessarily prove that Conrad would have read it maybe in the we think about the late 1880s, 1890s, that sort of thing. But again, it's kind of one of these problems of, you'll learn when you apply theory that sometimes you can't prove the people who you're saying apply the theory even knew the theory. But what you have to think is it's very, very unlikely that someone like Sylvia Plath or Joseph Conrad or William Carlos Williams wouldn't have known what Marxism was. Of course they did. Everyone knew what communism was, especially, I mean, if you were an American in the 1930s and 40s, my God, you knew what Marxism was, and you were taught to be scared of it. Now, let's have a little think at some of the key ideas that Marx has. So, if we go again, back onto slide 8 now, the division of labour. I'm not going to read these three quotes, but the first idea here is that labour is divided according to commercial, agricultural and industrial labour. Have a think about how you can see this in the texts we look at. Who represents industrial labour? Who works in factories? Who's a washerwoman? Think about that one. Sweat. Who represents commercial labour? Who works in a kind of, a kind of British establishment, maybe some sort of commercial control over things? Who represents that sort of thing? Who represents the commercial side of New York in a text? Who represents agricultural labour? Do we see anybody there who seems to be divided from the city? Have a look at the first quote. The division of labour inside a nation leads at first to the separation of industrial and commercial from agricultural labour, and hence to the separation of town and country. This sounds like a really obvious point, but you can read these quotes into the text that we look at. You can actually see that separation of town and country so clearly. Think about sweat. Now again, I haven't taught sweat properly yet. I'm actually going to be teaching it in the next lecture on Thursday. Again, it's going to be a virtual lecture like this. And thank you again for tuning in. I do appreciate it. But when we do sweat then properly, I think you'll kind of see how Zora Neale Hurston really does seem to be influenced by some of these evolving Marxist ideas. Now remember, Sweat came out in 1926, so kind of before the German Ideology was published, but we know that Zora Neale Hurston read Marx. We know that she read him in the 1910s. So we know there's a link there, there's no debating that. Have a look at the second, I think the big quotes I put in bullet points. The relative position of these individual groups is determined by the methods employed in agriculture, industry and commerce, patriarchalism, slavery, estates, classes. If you're looking to say how classes seem to be opposed to one another in a text, that's your quote. Tell me how. Tell me who seems to represent each one of these: patriarchalism, slavery, estates, classes. It's great for Heart of Darkness. You can really see those layers there in the class nuance. Have a look at the division of labour. A division of labour determines also the relations of individuals to one another. Again, this is kind of your closest idea of the Marxist classic communist thing. At the top we have the elite, at the bottom we have the little people doing all the hard work. The division of labour between those people determines the relations of individuals to one another. Now think about this is still true of today. We've probably all been to a party or some social gathering where you've been asked, what do you do? What do you do? Oh, what are you studying? Even what we're studying counts like this. And then depending on to whom you're speaking, you might get a kind of interested, oh, fascinating, oh, lovely, interested. Or you might get someone who seems to kind of look down on what you do. Oh, right. Oh, okay. They might kind of look over your shoulder and seem to be speaking to the next person. Now, I have to say, I do notice this happens less here in American society than British society. In Britain, most dinner parties will be governed with the first question, what do you do? And of course, your response to that really, I'm going to be honest, determines how they'll treat you for the rest of the night. Sadly. That's British class systems for you. We have a very kind of solid one where, you know, as we said before, that with the royal family, we have people at the top and then kind of things filtering down. Let's think about the split between different parts of society moving on. Marx also describes how the division of labour, so different types of work, creates an antagonism between town and country and the antagonism between industry and maritime commerce. This is a great quote for looking at Heart of Darkness. Industry, maritime commerce of the sea, trading, all of the stuff about the East India Trading Company. You can really read that quote into it just wonderfully. I've put some questions in red here. If you are thinking, well, how do I start applying this to my text? You know, what do I do with these quotes? Have a look at the questions in red and they'll help you start thinking about that for assignment 2. If you move on to the next slide, slide 9, resistance to class structures. This is a really good idea that Marx kind of comes across. The first quote here, individuals who are productively active in a definite way enter into these definite social and political relations. Okay, you can argue that they do when you see class structures reflected as you'd expect. If you see somebody at the top, you know, treating somebody at the bottom badly, you can say, well, as Marx argues, individuals who are productively active in a definite way enter into these definite social and political relations. Here we can see these definite social and political relations at play. But do you actually always see them at play? What about when individuals choose to resist these social and political relations? And they do all the time. Look at Marlowe. Look at the end of Heart of Darkness. What does he do? He gets to the abyss. He peeps over the edge. He could decide to be part of it all. He turns away. That's an it's almost showing how he resists this Marxist idea that we all enter into these definite social and political relations kind of almost resistantly. He really shows us how actually we don't always do that. Sometimes we go against that idea and we fight. If you think about it, we all still do that now. We all fight to not be put in a box sometimes. Look at the second quote. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas, i.e. the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. This is your big Marxist quote. When you're doing the reading and you're thinking, you know, where's the stuff about communism? This is as close as it gets. This is your big quote. The ideas of the ruling class, money, material, the class which is the ruling material force of society, is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. Now, whether we like it or not, it's kind of true. Let's be honest, those with money do have power. Often they can conflate that power with abuse of power or misuse of power. Can you find examples of that in the text? Of course you can. There's loads in all of the texts that we're looking at, from the red wheelbarrow with the white chickens to the red wheelbarrow, right through to Sweat. There's so many examples. Now, what's really interesting is if you have a piece of text where you have a character who seems to go against that grain. So can we find a class which is the ruling material force of society, maybe not being the ruling intellectual force? I'll give you a clue. Heart of Darkness. All hell breaks loose. Despite the colonizers' attempts to be the ruling intellectual and material class, they can't manage it, can they? Things dissipate. So again, what you'd say is here we see a subversion of the Marxist idea that, and then you'd insert that quote. Great, okay, lovely. So that's just some ideas that you can kind of insert Marxism into your work. And again, it's probably not what you expected. It's not the classic communist stuff, but it's a really good way of helping us to frame some kind of approaches for assignment 2. In the next slide, slide 10, I'm going to introduce you to assignment 2. Have a look at the assignment brief for that before we move on, okay?